Right. Can anyone hear me? Yeah? Sweet. Cool. OK. So this is 10 things every front-end developer should know about Connect. I am Chris Whittington. I am the JavaScript developer on the Connect team. I write JavaScript, so you don't have to write quite as much. So Connect with JavaScript. The main reason that you need to use a lot of JavaScript is because everything is done in an iframe if you're in the browser. And most front-end developers try their very best to steer clear of iframes, right? You're one step away from a frame set. It's not good. But actually, iframes offer a lot. They offer us a sandbox to protect our customers from some of the malicious code that could be run. Iframes do a lot, right? Iframes stop cookies, and this mic is weird. Iframes stop us setting cookies. They stop us resizing windows. They stop us using local storage and IndexedDB. And they stop us inheriting CSS and JavaScript. These are not really things we want for a Connect add-on. We've opened some of these things up. You can now update the history object. You can now set cookies across domains. You can now resize your own windows. And you can actually modify the product's DOM in a couple of different places. When you create iframes, when you create dialogues, when you create messages, those aren't within your iframe. Those are within the parent product. So you've started off with the Connect add-on. You've obviously gone to our amazing new Connect docs. You've gone and picked some really great modules that you're going to install. And you've got some iframes displaying. You've got hello world. You're all good. You should go and check out the JavaScript section. We have every single JavaScript method documented. We have every single parameter, every single return value, and every single one has its own example that you can copy and paste into a Connect iframe, and it will run. If you still get stuck, we've got the mailing list, where there is always a member of Atlassian staff who is looking at that every day from the Connect team who can answer your questions. So what happens when you go beyond the sample code? What happens when you start running your own code? And everyone's going to probably have some idea that that is the Chrome JavaScript console. So you know that it's the Chrome JavaScript console, but do you know what that dropdown does? I didn't know before I started on the Connect team. Every single person is going to open a console. They're going to go to type and to interact with their Connect JavaScript, and it's not going to work. You're going to get methods undefined. It's not going to work correctly. You can't even copy and paste the examples into the console. This drop-down menu will set the context of the console. You select your iframe. You can now use the console as normal. Firefox has its own version of this. It's not a drop-down menu. And when you go to the Firefox site to download it, for Mac at least, I got version 29. Make sure you're running 30+. You select your iframe as normal. And then you run this console command, cd, to set the context. Believe it or not, Internet Explorer has actually beaten Firefox to the drop-down for Internet Explorer 11. And as long as you have the developer tools installed for Internet Explorer 9 and beyond, you can use the same cd command as Firefox, which is pretty great. If you're not in one of those browsers and you still need to debug your JavaScript, you can try window.frames one dot a function that you're trying to invoke. Some browsers, you will need to run a particular parameter when you open the browser to disable some security features. Other times it won't work entirely. I wouldn't recommend it, but if you end up in a real pinch, give it a go. It might help you out. So something we've added that's entirely new in Connect that goes beyond what we can do with P2 is web item target options. Web items are usually pretty boring, right? They're a button or a link that you can add some style classes to, but not very much. The great thing about web items for Connect is that web items are in a lot of places, right? There are probably, I don't know, 70, 80 plugin points across Jira and Confluence. And if you're going to make something which has a lot of plugin points, you're going to run into these. So what we can do with target options is open dialogues, display inline dialogues from those web item target locations. Here's a great example of this. You can see at the top, there is a very tiny icon that looks like a normal web item. But when you click it, you get an inline dialogue. This is Sam Day's Confluence Stats plugin, and it works really well. Here's a quick piece of sample code from the descriptor. The location is a normal P2 plugin location, but you can see now, unlike a normal web item descriptor, you have this target section, and you have a type of inline dialogue. The options below this match what is available with AUI. So the Atlassian user interface, when you are invoking inline dialogues, you pass an object with a set of parameters. We have matched those parameters, so it should be relatively familiar. I'm not going to talk too much about no-auth. Tim covered this earlier, and it's too much of a good point to not mention again. If you're rapidly prototyping something, use no-auth. As a front-end developer, you don't want to be worrying about servers. You don't want to be worrying about JWT. This will get you going in a single HTML file, right? You can have your Connect descriptor, one HTML file, and you can have an entirely running add-on. Even if you just prototype that way, even if you just want to see what your UI is going to look like, start here and branch out from there. Maybe have some of your other developers working on the back end of your add-on, while you can be plumbing away, getting things up and running. So I briefly mentioned AUI. It's the Atlassian user interface. People have already mentioned how much incredible features are in AUI and how many more things are coming. You can use AUI in your Connect add-ons. You can add the same classes that you'll find in the existing Atlassian products. You can use your normal inspector, you can see those classes, add them to your own elements, and they will look the same. Well, the other element of the design guide actually goes beyond AUI. Not only does it have the AUI components and where you can use them, it actually has a whole design approach. It goes into how things should be laid out, what colors to use where, what typography you should be using, what icons, even down to the date format. These are things that you don't even think about, or maybe you're localizing them to your own language. But we've already done this for you, and if you're getting stuck about what color you should make a button, or should you use a slider somewhere, give this a read. AUI Sandbox. It is a great, great tool to get started. This will give you copy and pastable examples that you can put into your HTML pages, and it's going to look like that, and that's pretty awesome. If you combine that with what you see in the Connect docs, you could probably make quite a few add-ons copy-pasting things together. So I want to talk briefly about using the REST APIs. People have already mentioned that from JavaScript, you can run REST API functions. And Tim made a lot of great use cases for that yesterday. You can do all of these great things, and you should really consider if you really need a back-end server at all. If this will allow you to get prototyping faster, great. Here's a quick example, though. So this might look familiar. The object that you pass to request is the same as a jQuery AJAX object. It looks pretty familiar, as well as the URL and success. You can also use fail if the AJAX request fails to run. This will usually be because you haven't set the correct scopes. So what if you don't want to request to the product? What if you want to request to your own server? we've already known that you can't set cookies. So you can't have a session. If you can't have a session, how do you keep user-specific data in your own servers? Well, the answer that we've come up with is to use tokens. These are basically session cookies held in a string that are passed backwards and forwards between your add-on server and your JavaScript. The Atlassian Connect Express and the AC Play frameworks provide this token support out of the box. We've implemented a 15-minute expiry, and it looks something like this. So a request comes in from your add-on server to load a HTML page into the user's browser. You bundle your token into a meta tag or some other tag to put the token on the page. An AJAX request takes that token and sends it as a HTTP header along with the rest of the AJAX payload back to your server. You can then validate that this is a valid token. And when you send the response with hopefully something like JSON, you can include a new token in the response headers. So here's a quick example. This is taken from the Atlassian Connect Express framework. You can see that the token in the top example is a handlebars variable in a template, and the bottom piece is just a standard query AJAX call. But you'll notice that there is before send. Now, in our case, we've set the token to a variable called token, and we're using the xaccept header to add this to the outbound request. Here is a more full example of what you would do when you send a request. And also, there's a new section at the bottom which covers what happens when the AJAX request comes back with a new header. You can notice when you're sending the request, you set a request header, and when you get the response, you're getting a response header. But that token variable is set outside of the request, and so you can store this in the state of your application. You shouldn't worry too much about overlapping tokens. What happens if someone clicks a button twice, or they just try and do 2 requests at the same time? Well, because you have the 15-minute expiry, all tokens are valid for those 15 minutes. As long as you end up with a valid token, you're all good. So in Connect, we are big fans of events. Everything that you're going to be using in Connect is going to be asynchronous. And this is because the power of Connect comes from the window.postMessage JavaScript API. This sends a message from your iframe up to the main product window. We validate that it's a real request, and then we execute on it, and maybe if you're requesting information, we return a response. Events can help you, and we already have an event framework that you can access. You'll find when you're using callbacks, you'll end up 4 or 5 callbacks deep, and your code will become pretty untestable. How can you test a unit test when you're trying to do 4 or 5 callbacks? So we have some predefined events, and we're looking to expand that. You can emit your own custom events, and the most important thing here is that you can send data between your own iframes. So if you register for an event in one frame, you can see that in another. So here's an example. Let's say you have 2 web panels on the same page. In the first web panel, you're registering for an event called message, and you're passing it the function to execute when you receive that message, which is alert. The second iframe emits the event message with the text hello world, and this is going to create an alert box with the text hello world. This example is pretty trivial, but a common use case will be if you're opening a dialog and you're displaying a form, and then you want the response of that form to come back to your other window. Let's say it's a general page or a web panel. You can use the event system to emit that data back to your first page. Wow, that skipped a lot. All right, so everyone's been asking for the ability to modify the URL. We added it. It's not quite in Connect yet. The code is there, we're testing it internally, and it's going to be deployed in the near future. We know that large applications are going to need to keep their state. If you're going to build something like Jira Agile, you're going to be able to make copy and pastable links and send them to other people. We can't expect people to click through 5 or 6 different links to get to the same place as someone else. We modeled it around the HTML5 history API. If you've used push state and pop state, you'll be familiar with this. We support go, back, and forward, but it's only available on page modules. And this is because if you had web panels and there were 5 or 6 add-ons on a page, which we hope there will be, if they're all trying to change the URL, we're going to end up in a bad state. So here's a quick example of what some of those calls look like. So I've already required the history module, and I've assigned it to AC history. You can get the current state from the URL, and you'll be doing this on every page load if you're using the history feature. To get your existing state, imagine you can pass this to a backbone router or an Ember router to replace the current state in your application. You can push in new state, and what this will do is add a hashbang to the end of the URL in the main window. So this goes up from your iframe, where the history is pretty unuseful, to the top window in the product, and it appends to the URL. We use a hashbang because unlike the normal HTML5 history API, we support back to Internet Explorer 8. Pop state should be pretty familiar too. This happens when people press the back and forward buttons within their browser. Usually, you'll have no idea of this if you're in an iframe, and that's not that helpful. We've emulated the HTML5 history API again, and you can register to receive a callback when a browser button is clicked. And we used the standard event object with old URL and new URL. So, speed. We're not embedded anymore. We're in an iframe. There's HTTP requests, right? HTTP requests mean latency. Latency usually means degraded user experience. And that's something that we're pretty passionate about. The easiest way that you can get rid of the loading spinner that appears with Atlassian Connect is to get the Atlassian Connect JavaScript on the page and execute it as quickly as possible. If you're not using JWT, you can have a static HTML page, like Tim was saying in his talk. You can set a far future expiry date, and that spinner will disappear immediately. If you are using JWT, you may wish to flush the head of the page early. You can also help us by serving AUI from the correct URL. You can download the AUI Flatpak and include it in your own add-on. If we've got 5 or 6 add-ons on a page, and they're all downloading their own copies of the AUI Flatpak, that's going to degrade everyone's experience. We have our own Atlassian CDN, we have our own CDN URLs, and we have a recommended version of the Atlassian user interface. It's in the Connect documentation. You keep it up to date, and by the time someone downloads your Connect add-on and sees the iframes, they've probably already downloaded someone else's, and so there won't be any overhead there. My last point is about the resizer. The resizer allows the iframe to be seamless in the page. No matter how big that your iframe content is, we automatically resize the width and height of the iframe to fit that content. And that's great. But we're trying to support a lot of implementations because it's such a great feature. And that means that people don't always implement it correctly. So we have levels of support here. If you do what's in the documentation, and you have a wrapping class around your layout, and you give it a class of AC content, we append a couple of additional divs to the bottom of the page, which we can use to sense when the width and height changes. We can then bubble up an event, and we can resize the frame. If that doesn't happen for some reason, we go back to long polling, which is whereby every 120 milliseconds, we will query the document to see if it has changed height. Right? And then we will resize. This does not look very smooth, but it does do what it's intended to do. If you don't want to get into that situation, you can disable the resizer by using the snippet in the bottom, when you include all.js. If you can get away with knowing when you resize your content, you can call our own all.js JavaScript function and inform it that your content has changed height, and we will immediately resize your iframe. This is a better experience. It's just a bit of an implementation detail. All right. Questions? Sweet.
All right. If there's no questions, thanks very much, Chris.